we would definitely want to welcome all of you as viewers to this ongoing conversation that we are having as it relates to transformative SEL or using SEL as a lever for equity. We welcome you to the conversation. We're excited that you're here. And we're hopeful that you will gain some strategies and some ideas on how to continue to put this work into practice, out of the theoretical and into the practical, that will really impact students and impact the young people and impact our societies where we are. Why we are doing this series now is we are in a time where we are clearly recognizing that to not provide concrete steps on how to arrive at equity serves to ignore the inequities that are in our system, and it perpetuates the racial injustice that lays there. So we are wanting to make sure that we not only talk about it, but provide the field with opportunities to learn from experts, from leaders who are doing the work. And this first part of our 5-part series will allow you to do just that. So to ground this conversation and ensure that we're all landing on a shared understanding, we want to ensure that there's some clarity on what we mean by transformative SEL. So you'll see on your screen our definition. If you weren't with us last week, I definitely want to encourage you to go to our CASEL page and download and listen to our session last week that really gives you an overview of transformative SEL, the research behind it, and the why of the work. But here's the definition that we introduced to our viewers last week. It really is a process. We're still talking about SEL as a process that happens for young people and adults. You'll see here that we really call out not just the relationships, but what the relationships lead to. That it really is about co-learning. It's about co-constructing spaces with young people. It's about examining root causes of inequity and really coming together to develop collaborative solutions that can really transform us as individuals, our communities, and our overall society. And so that's what we mean by transformative SEL. You'll be hearing us reference that throughout this session. We wanted to make sure that you had some clear understanding of what that is when you hear it. In addition, we want to call your attention to the competencies that you have come to know as the CASEL 5 for some of you. Emily, if you can put the slide up with the competencies. Thank you. What you see here is just the different way to extend our understanding about the competencies. So whereas we've talked about awareness, as it relates to transformative SEL, you are now seeing examples such as how are we aware of our own race, our own class, identity, and what that brings to this conversation about equity. When we talk about self-management, we're really thinking about our collective agency and how we're positioning ourselves to be a part of the solution and a part of the conversation that leads to change. Social awareness, we're really talking about the belonging and the pieces and the practices that allow us to foster belonging across identities and across races. And so you'll see with the relationship skills and responsible decision making, how we're really diving into these competencies in a way that we have more of a charge to transform the environments that we're in. And so that just kind of lays out some of the pieces that will ground our conversation today. So for the we've done as an organization with districts, we've landed on some emerging insights regarding how districts are leveraging SEL in service of equity. Joining me now to share their experiences are 2 people who are doing this work at the school district level and at the state level. Eric Moore and Heather Hirsch are 2 individuals that I'd like to introduce you to, who will be talking to us in this conversation. Eric, if you can join me on the screen as well. It's good to see you both. Really excited about this conversation that we're about to engage in. I've learned a little bit of work. We have worked extensively with Minneapolis Public Schools, and it really is an honor to have just your level of expertise and your passion about this work on this webinar today. I do want to just caveat and say that we're extremely grateful for just your ability to expend time in this way, knowing that you are in the state of Minnesota. Eric, you are working in Minneapolis schools. And though this racial conversation has been one that's continued for quite some time in our country, this recent trigger happened right there in your backyard. So we're really appreciative of the time that you're taking. We know that you are super busy, but we know that what you have to offer today will really be of help to everyone who's viewing. So thank you again. Eric Moore is Chief of Accountability, Research and Equity at Minneapolis Public Schools, and Heather Hirsch is School Climate Specialist at Minnesota Department of Education. So to start us off, I'd just like to ask both of you, and Heather, maybe we can start with you, is what brings you to this work, and what are some of the ways that you have been able to, through the work that you've done, really link and integrate this work of SEL and equity?
Yeah, thank you, Ludine. At the Department of Education, we started focusing on social emotional learning several years ago because we are one state who has a law, the Minnesota Safe and Supportive Schools Act, that requires school districts in Minnesota to implement evidence-based social emotional learning. And our role is to provide guidance and technical assistance to help districts implement the various laws and statutes that apply to teaching and learning. We brought together a group of stakeholders from across the state implementing social emotional learning and talked to them about what would be helpful in guidance to do SEL in schools. And we developed a comprehensive set of K-12 learning goals, benchmarks, and aligned them to Minnesota's academic standards. And we really felt there was something missing when we developed that work. And the stakeholder group felt as though it would be a disservice to just put that information out, as though that was all it took to do SEL. And so instead, we also developed some implementation guidance and assessment guidance and prefaced that guidance with equity considerations that we co-developed with the Great Lakes Equity Center as a way to really position educators across the state as they started this work to really first reflect on their own bias, privilege, and power in order to be doing SEL, benefiting each of their individual students' growth and development. And so that is what I do at the Department of Education. I lead a team that implements comprehensive school mental health, social emotional learning, restorative practices, and school climate improvement. And we're fortunate we get to work with Eric and Kessel quite often in Minnesota.
Thank you, Heather. How about you, Eric?
Thank you. It's good to be here. And I actually, if you see in the background, I cleaned off my whiteboard for everyone so that I wouldn't distract everyone. So I work in Minneapolis Public Schools, and I just love the work that I do, love the opportunity to support our students and families here in the district. I currently serve as the Chief of Accountability, Research and Equity. That is responsible for all of the research, program evaluation, assessment in the district. That's including both the traditional modes of assessment as well as social and emotional measurement. Also responsible for aligning department plans, school improvement plans to the district strategic plan, and as well as being in charge of Title I, II, IV, or AYP dollars. Also in charge of integration funding, integration programming, as well as social emotional learning, follow school on engagement. What brings me to the work is, I think, just a significant passion for the opportunity to align supports and services to support our students. I really believe that social emotional learning and equity, when they're combined and interconnected, as I believe they are, it really is one of the missing pieces to addressing the gaps in opportunity and learning for our students. And I think that one of the challenges we've seen in education is that we have not accepted the full selves of our students. And in many cases, students and families have to leave parts of their identity at the door in order to participate in the education system. This leaving parts of identity at the door, I think, is really irresponsible for a lot of disengagement from our students from the domain of learning. So I think we honor who students are, we honor who families are, that we have a significant opportunity to address gaps in opportunity in learning.
Thank you for that. And I think the piece that you were just talking about in how we're asking students to leave pieces of themselves at the door speaks to some of the declarative statements that we made last week of Transformative SEL. We've had numerous questions about participants who saw that webinar wondering, well, if I'm only doing SEL as I've known it, am I causing harm? You know, and so that's a question that folks are grappling with. So I'd like you to kind of talk about that. And Eric, you said you said before that it is time for a new dialogue and narrative about equity and SEL. So from your experience at the school district level, how would you answer the question regarding SEL as we've known it and the possibility of causing harm? And what are some of the resulting differences for students, for staff, parents, community, when they're addressing SEL with this transformative lens that we're talking about now?
Well, I think it's fundamentally providing spaces for people to be fully human, and that matters. I mean, obviously that matters. I think that when I think about transformative SEL, issues such as justice and fairness, voice, agency, identity, all aspects of identity, power, recognizing that adults create the spaces for students to be their best selves. And that's something where we're not just using social and emotional learning to fix students, which often, unfortunately, when I believe it's misused, is to only address behavior, but it's really placing the responsibility on the adults to say we have the responsibility and the power and opportunity to create spaces for students to be their best selves. And I've seen that, and I shared with you before, you know, as we do measurement around social emotional learning, you know, I came to the conclusion in some cases that what I was actually measuring was the extent to which students are conforming to white spaces. And I had to shift my lens in terms of the work that I'm doing and really taking a look at the adults. And because what we found, and this is from the work of Camille Farrington in particular, is that those social emotional skills as measured, they vary by space, they vary by classroom, they vary versus being in a classroom, being out of school time community. And so we know that we are directly responsible for how students engage with adults and how they engage in learning spaces. And so I think that's just been a fundamental learning, and it just identifies the importance of doing the transformative social and emotional learning, because we have the agency and the ability to create positive spaces and outcomes for our students, without question.
Thank you. Heather, on the state level, what are some of the ways that you're seeing, because I'm assuming that you have kind of a larger scope around maybe a broader sense of Minnesota in general. What are some of the ways that you are seeing different districts talk about transformative SEL and how that started to impact some change at the district level? And if you've seen some of the shifts happening at the state level, we'd love to hear about that as well, because we know what happens at the state rolls down and impacts what happens at the district level also.
Right now, I really see the state and my team specifically taking the lead in that area. We certainly, because of what's been going on in Minneapolis the past few weeks, have been getting a lot more questions about how can I embed equity into our SEL conversations, or vice versa, how can I embed the two? But that is something that we at the state have been thinking about for quite a while, and actually are focusing a lot of our upcoming work on partnerships with Castle and others to develop some professional development for staff and for educators around culturally affirming social emotional learning and culturally sustaining SEL, and what does that look like, and how do staff create the space for that? And I really do look to our partners like Eric and Minneapolis Public Schools and the other districts in the CDI on how to do that. We've been fortunate in having a long relationship with those districts and been able to learn from districts who've been doing this work for a long time, and then can share those pieces with districts who are just starting to think about what does this mean, or just expanding their thinking of SEL from a curriculum or a program to really true school-wide systemic social emotional learning, and the differences in those two kind of deliveries. And so we're fortunate. We're learning from Minneapolis and how they're embedding equity in their social emotional learning standards. We're really looking as a state to help make that as easy as possible as we can for schools and districts by developing professional learning opportunities and by partnering with our academic standards teams to really make sure that they are developed through the lens of SEL in service to educational equity, and spending a lot of time educating those teams developing that. But I will say it's a relatively new ask that we're getting from districts at the state level.
Absolutely. As you're thinking about, part of what we want to talk about today is just the visioning aspect of bringing this work to a district, and not only the vision of it, but the implementation and how do you sustain that as well. There is already a narrative out there about social emotional learning, or what we're calling SEL. There's a lot of miscommunication. There's implementation that might lead to the perception that SEL is a tool to fix children, right, or to right the behaviors or attitudes of Black and brown children, which further, exacerbates the injustices that we are attempting to correct. So in the ways, can you talk a little bit, either of you can jump on this, what are some of the ways that you have worked to intentionally bring in an accurate narrative of transformative SEL, and to include in that narrative not only the students, but the system as a whole, adults as a whole? So what are some of the ways that you've been able to shift that narrative?
Well, I really appreciate you saying that. And in my measurement example, I think that it's fundamentally necessary to understand that we're operating in spaces of white supremacy, and what's normalized and how we do our work is all based in this space of whiteness. And so part of it is you just having to name that. And that causes you to re-examine your work, to say, are there different ways of knowing and doing our work? One of the things that we started 4 years ago in Minneapolis Public Schools is we started a program called Youth Participatory Evaluation. So we took our researchers and evaluators in the department, provided training and support to our students on data collection methods. They were able to define issues that were relevant to them. And then they did the data collection and present it to teachers and administrators or principals and inform district practice, but really taking the voices of the students, placing that at the center and to inform our practice. And we did that as a result of a civil rights agreement, because we were disproportionately identified by the feds, disproportionately suspending African American, American Indian students. And so we could have done a traditional approach of just having a listening session, but we wanted to transform the way that we used student voice and agency to help us do our work better. So that's why we wanted to do the Youth Participatory Evaluation program. That's in every middle and high school right now in the district. 2 years ago, we started a program called Parent Participatory Evaluation along the same lines, working with our families to reconceptualize what good research is. We had to understand, again, operate under a sphere of white supremacy, that our traditional data collection methods weren't yielding information that was allowing us to make decisions that were in the best interest and relevant to our communities of color. And so our parents, by placing them at the center of knowledge production and the data collection, are able to go out and get response rates that we've never been able to get as a school district. And that's where actually through their agency and voice are able to do our work better. So we have those two programs, Youth Participatory Evaluation and Parent Participatory Evaluation. I'll tell you that, and then as a district, what we did intentionally is we aligned in both cases the recommendations that those groups have with our budget process. So as those families, for example, make recommendations, we're able to align budget so that we can implement. And that's critical because this work also occurs in a historical narrative. Historically, we haven't placed students at the center. We don't listen to students when they make their recommendations. Where our schools are adult spaces traditionally. Historically, we have not listened to communities of color. We've collected information, but we have not aligned that to action. So we are very intentional of aligning it to budget, which would then align it to action, which then creates a space of trust, right? And so that we, to the extent that we listen, but then we do, we believe that we can create better spaces for trust. But that was an example of like recognizing the white supremacist way we were operating in many cases in the space of whiteness, and taking the traditional ways we've always done it, finally acknowledging that we're not getting the information we need to fully support our families of color in particular and our students, thinking about a different way of what good knowledge production is, having a high level of rigor, but we've been using that to really transform the way we're doing our work. And I think I've never seen things move as much as in terms of policy recommendations as until we started doing this work, because fundamentally we do our work because we love our children, we care about our communities, and we respect our families. And so providing an opportunity for those students and parents to have voice and present that in a systematic way has just been phenomenal. But it's aligned to the transformative nature of social emotional learning, which is agency, voice, power, decentering knowledge production and power, and just in creating spaces for people to be heard. I mean, I think that's just critical.
So this brings up the idea of when you, let's bring it down a little bit to even just the district level, and then what happens at the classroom level. When you're in the process of creating a vision for this work and creating a plan, can either of you talk about what are some of the steps that are included in creating and nailing down a vision that can actually carry this work? And we know that districts are already facing, teachers and school leaders, they're facing initiative fatigue. There's always a new initiative, there's always a new tool, a new resource. How do we make sure that folks feel like this is something that is just that this is something that undergirds the entire learning process, so that they can really feel the need to take the time and invest the personal time to get better at it, and invest their professional time to get better at it? What are some of the ways that you have been able to build kind of a visioning process that allows folks to come on board, understand what this is, and plug into SEL as a systemic process? Heather, how about we start with you on that one?
Yeah, we really feel strongly that in order for schools and districts to develop a vision that all of their stakeholders can see themselves reflected in, they need to really start with their values. And that's not just the licensed staff, it's looking at all of the adults in the building. What are their values around their work and around education and around our students? And then moving to your students and your families. What are their values? Why are they choosing to have their kids attend your school, participate in your programs? And then that value also creates an anchoring experience where folks can come back to when they start having the more difficult conversations about what is the best thing for this space, or developing a budget. Are we aligning our budget to our values and our vision? And so I do also recognize, and I know Eric can talk a lot about this too, but developing a vision and doing systemic social emotional learning is an iterative process. You start with values and you start with a vision, but as you continue engaging different stakeholders, as you continue moving through the work, you're going to come back and reevaluate that vision numerous times throughout, using the different data that you're going to be collecting and the different input that you're getting from various groups. And so I think that's really at the heart of that work. It's recognizing that it's not a permanent piece, and recognizing that it really needs to start from the values of the people that it's serving.
Yeah, Heather, I think that's so critical. I really appreciate that. I mean, it's the values. It's really defining, for example, how do we see our children that we're working with? How do we see our families? What are our values around students participating? Do we have a value of creating spaces for voice and choice and collaboration? Do we have the value that we expect our students to be vessels in which we're telling students what to do, how to behave, or are we sharing power and co-constructing that? Like, those are values that have to be declared. And once you identify your values, I think the other thing is in our district, we selected a framework. So we have a social emotional learning framework. So we use the CASTLE framework. And we select the framework based upon the values that we have around children and adults and how we want to engage. And that's a really important piece, because I think, what I've seen in other situations in other districts is that there's a misalignment sometimes between values and frameworks, or different departments are using different frameworks. Frameworks, right, are a set of ideas. Why does that matter? Because your programming then should come from your framework and your values. Many times the programming isn't aligned to the values, or there's different values and frameworks operating in buildings. And so it sounds, it's very technical, but it's very important from a planning standpoint, because it really makes sure that there's coherence across all the different levels of the system. And then I do final pieces. Again, Heather mentioned that, so it's in being inclusive. So you have to be very clear on who you're serving, and that's a value. To what extent do you value having the folks that you're expected to serve, in our case, in a district, parents, community members, teachers, to what extent do we provide spaces for them to fully participate? And to what extent do we have a facilitation process that it recognizes different aspects of power within a meeting? I mean, these are all intentional things that you have to be able to do. But again, if you don't have the value and the understanding that power plays a role in keeping people from participating and being their best selves and fully sharing their identities and voices and spaces, then you continue with the status quo, which is that some groups get to participate and others don't. So I think that's being very intentional on naming your values, selection of framework, having structures and spaces for people to participate, being very persistent and determined to get different groups to participate, recognizing that as a system it's our fault that groups aren't participating, because we have a litany of failed promises, and so that's a historical narrative, I think, in marginalized community is that folks in power engage and then they invite, but they don't do anything. And so I think in many cases it's a rational decision for folks not to participate, because it's really hard for people to be in spaces in which they're not valued and respected, right? And so that's work we have to do as systems to make sure those marginalized voices are helping us create systems that can better serve everyone, and we haven't done that.
Yeah, and when the both of you talk about values and how that impacts the visioning process of what systemic SEL is, what comes to mind for me is the importance of broadening our understanding of what social emotional learning actually is. For some, it may be an understanding that it's a curriculum, or it's something that we do for a few minutes and that's our SEL moment for the day. But the way that the two of you are talking about SEL, it seems like you have broadened the definition of it, that it really is a system change, a system approach. Maybe in the way that we almost call a three-legged stool, where we talk about SEL as academic integration, SEL as instruction, and also SEL as the culture and the climate of our actual organization. Speak to the way that thinking about SEL in this systemic way can cultivate commitment around this work. What are some of the ways that you have seen that as we broaden out the definition of SEL, that it almost broadens out who actually has work to do in this? It extends out where we see our role in this work. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you've seen? Eric, how about we start with you on that one?
Well, my mind is going to some work we have to do tonight, actually. We've recently started a climate framework steering committee, and the task force is aligned to that work. Again, we recognize that we can have a lot of technical pieces and programs and structures, but we also need to pay attention to the adaptive work. of making sure that people feel valued within the organization, right? So the committees, for example, we have a teaching and learning task force, which is looking at how is it that what we teach and how we teach and what we teach support students engaging and having relationships within the classroom or not. We're looking at our interpersonal pieces. So how do adults engage with each other, particularly around our evaluation systems, our teacher evaluation system, our principal evaluation system. So there's a task force that's defining the values around the interpersonal piece. We're looking at redefining family and community engagement and having values explicit around that and having a set of belief statements. Aligning all of our, there's a task force aligning all of our counseling and social work and psychologists so that we have an aligned system of fully support the whole child and the needs of the whole child. The other is physical safety. You mentioned, the unrest uprising around George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd. And so that committee is looking at how do we, and we've recently decided to non-renew the contract for our school resource officers. And so we're really taking a look at what are our beliefs around supporting students when we have adults that are engaging students and recognizing there's power and we need to support those students. How do we redefine systems of support for our students? If we have to have folks that are doing security, there are things we can do better and more respectfully as we're engaging students, and we can also take a more preventative approach. So that task force is also looking at physical safety. We know this, that as students enter buildings, depending on the part of the city, the way a building looks, the way the grass is cut or not, the extent to which a building is clean, sends a signal to different students. And I've personally witnessed students of color being in buildings that in some cases aren't as clean or new. And then they travel across the city in a predominantly white area of the city, and it's just gorgeous. The colors are different. There's paint, bright colors. You go to another part of the city in the low income areas, and you see more grays and browns, and that physical space is about compliance. Whereas some of the other spaces in wealthier areas are more vibrant and livelier, right? So that matters in terms of social emotional learning and how we emotionally connect to a space. The last thing is we're looking at a sense of belonging, and Minneapolis Public Schools, our superintendent and school board, we have committed in partnership with our teachers union to in the next 5 years have restorative practices training for all of our building staff. So we will have restorative practices. We are also going to have equity training for every staff person in the district. And that's a commitment, a line item commitment that our board has identified to the tune of about $800,000 to $1 million a year, so that we do the right work, because so much of this work about transformative SEL is mindset, adult mindset. And until we have that shared values of looking at students as assets, and that we have the ability to bring out the best of our students, regardless of whatever they're bringing to the classroom. But we have that agency and power to create a phenomenal experience for the students in the classroom, not only academically, but emotionally, socially. And until we recognize students have the ability, like they emotionally connect to learning, those students who have that positive emotional connection to the learning process, it supports their learning, it supports their retention of knowledge. Like we have to have professional development on that and provide spaces for the adults to have conversations, and also like struggle and deconstruct previous learnings and knowledges that all of us have had when we were going through our own training programs, where we were taught that everything was cognitive, and we were taught that we're not supposed to engage in the fullness and wholeness of children. And so we're going to do that professional development. I'm really excited about it. Because ultimately it comes down to the teachers in front of the students, it comes down to the bus drivers, and with the experiences of how they're engaging, the child nutrition person, how they're engaging. Like we're all responsible for the climate that causes students to excel and have joy in a space, or cause them to disengage and leave the system. And so that's our work. But that's like a systemic approach, because we're trying to take a look at all those different areas and take a look at climate and social and emotional learning, and like how does it show up in each of those areas to contribute to a climate in which all people are able to be their best selves, adults, students, right, parents, community members. I mean, that's the work. And being delivered on those task forces, we are very clear that those task forces all have students, parents, all the different unions are part of those groups. Central office, we're very clear on not having a task force that's full of just central office people, again, recognizing power principles. So we're being very deliberate about that kind of work, but I think that's what it takes if you're going to do the transformative work and kind of deconstruct systems that in many cases were built to provide advantages to some and to marginalize others. I mean, our systems were created to do that. And so this really involves major deconstruction and intentionality.
I truly appreciate even your context of naming some of the folks within our educational system that we don't typically name when we think about professional learning, when we think about a new district vision. We may not think about the bus driver, we may not think about those providing food and nutrition services, but they touch students as well, and students have interactions with them that lead to a perception about their educational experience. I will call out a question that came in from one of our registrants was about some people might be listening to this conversation and really want to join in the work of transformative SEL. How do they handle it when they are in spaces where the leaders are not embracing transformative SEL practices? Like, how do we build commitment? There's a system level work around transformative SEL, but there's also the individual work around transformative SEL as well. And so how do we help individuals understand how to commit to these practices, even if the larger system has not quite caught up to where we are in this conversation as well? Heather, what are some ideas that you might have for that individual?
Yeah. Just reflecting back on your previous question, I think it really gets to, as we're thinking about unpacking what social emotional learning can be and what school climate and culture are, I mean, it's creating safe and culturally sustaining environments for all students. And so if we're really going to invest in that work, our guidance at the state level is you have to start with the adults. And we're really conscious about naming adults and not teachers or licensed staff because of the examples that both you and Eric pulled out, is that students are having interactions with all sorts of staff, licensed, non-licensed, contracted staff, employed staff, certified staff. And we need to be really aware that they need to be part of the conversations and the journey about their own social and self-awareness, just like any of the teachers who might be doing more of the explicit instruction, but everyone in the school community needs to be reinforcing that work. And I think that that's really becoming more clear as we are working with more and more districts trying to tackle this. And so we do occasionally have individual teachers who say, you know, I just really feel strongly this is work that I need to do, whether or not I have support. And so we certainly are willing to help them and certainly lend on the 10 key instructional practices that inherently build SEL, and really focusing in on their individual work around power and privilege as an educator. But we also share with them talking about what social emotional learning actually can do. And so it's about really supporting and developing school climate and culture. It's about reinforcing and building relationships, both student-student, staff-student, and adult-adult. It's about enhancing connectedness and belonging. And essentially that's laying a foundation for successful instruction. And because kids can't learn if they don't feel safe, and if adults aren't intentional about creating that safe, supportive, culturally sustaining environment for all of their kids, it won't matter which curriculum you're using. It just won't connect to all of your kids.
Thank you. Let's dig into the question about pushback and buy-in. What are some of the common, I see you laughing, I think you've encountered this from time to time.
Well, and we've been able to overcome it. You know, I think You know, it's interesting because what I've learned over the years in doing, and I call it equity work. I mean, I think that, and I think, so I believe that you can't do social and emotional learning without also doing equity if you're doing it the way it's intended to be. I mean, like, you can't address the emotional nature of a human being without also recognizing the identity of the folks, and that identity shows up in very different ways. But I think that we've had to do it a number of ways. So I think for some, the ability to measure social and emotional learning skills and or climate, and look at the relationship between the skills and traditional things such as discipline referrals and academic growth. And the extension of that was saying, and as adults, you're the one responsible for how students feel and show up in the classroom. And we've always intuitively seen that. We've seen students who excel in one classroom in a middle school, they go to the next one, and they're struggling. They go to the next classroom and they're struggling. All of a sudden, they're just like the most amazing artist or musician when they're not in school, and they're showing up so differently. So we quantified it. So that was for some, is that we look at the relationship between measurement and the things that some folks care about, right? And we say, well, this is the whole child. You educate the whole child. You have to do, in order to get a student to do well academically in the classroom and have that sense of motivation and feel positive about themselves, and you're responsible for that. But the other is voice. For others, they need to hear directly. So that, like, the parent evaluation work was critical when you had parents from our Somali community, our African American community, our American Indian community, our Hmong community, our Latino community, when they all, our special education community, when they all talked about how they didn't feel valued and respected, and so as they were speaking about their own projects, you started seeing a theme emerge. And as our board members and our senior leaders started to see that theme, like, the light bulb clicked on in some cases, because some people have to hear directly from students and families about that. But the problem is they have to hear it in a particular way, right? But we were able to present the information in a systematic way that there wasn't any way that people couldn't hear the message. So you just have to engage in multiple ways and recognize that people take in information very differently. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is I just like kind of say, disintegrate people's worldview. You're trying to get them to think that there is a different perspective, and you're having to understand that people hear things very differently. And so you have to engage in multiple ways. For some, it was the measurement. Others, it was like hearing directly from our students and our families. And so we've done it in multiple ways. And then, you have to declare, like, this is the challenge we have. This is what we're going to do about it. And then we monitor that and we measure it. And then we come back and we say, we said this was going to work and this is how well it's working. And then you start making believers out of people, and because you're systematically collecting the information. So that's been very critical. To the extent now, in our district in Minneapolis, I mean, we inherently just believe it. We believe that climate impacts achievement. We believe that adults create the spaces for students to be their best selves. We believe that we're not doing social emotional learning just for behavior. We believe that we should share power. That's the narrative. That doesn't mean we're all doing it. And I mean, that's just why you have to do the ongoing work around professional development, and you reinforce that. And we're doing this climate framework about reinforcing our values, making our values visible. But I'll tell you that I think what I'm excited about is making values visible around equity, having a school board policy around equity, having a department of equity and social emotional learning embedded in an accountability department. Like, these are the types of things where like, we're actually able to hold people accountable for and each other accountable for treating families and students with the respect they deserve. But it's a process. Like, you have to align it to the have a monitoring system, measurement, and then voice. And I think you have to systematically collect voice, create spaces for people to be heard, be very intentional about that. And I think that, in some regards, I mean, I'm a realist, but I'm also an optimist because I've seen things change. You just have to present information in different ways for people to hear it, and stay persistent and determined. This is the right work to do. All of us have seen students just glow and when they're in spaces and they feel fully valued. I mean, it's just a beautiful thing to see those students, and it's heartbreaking when they don't feel valued, and we've seen that as well. So you're just having to persevere and provide those multiple opportunities for people to hear, either through alignment to what they traditionally know, right, and or creating the spaces for the voices to be heard directly. Lots of reflection. It takes time, and it's not linear, so you have to provide the ongoing support in doing the work as well. And then it will happen, but yeah, you're always going to have naysayers. But I think you are deliberately creating a group of folks that can move this work forward. And what I see is very liberating and exciting when you do say, as a school system, we value who you are as your whole self, and working through that is extremely important. I'm really excited about, we're trying to do this climate work, this climate framework, very intentional of trying to partner with our Federation of Teachers, our teachers union, and co-chairing that work. In July, co-chairing that work with the head of our teachers union. And I think, again, when you think about climate, what's the narrative typically in school districts about teachers and central office administrators not being able to work together and on behalf of our kids and families? And so we're going to be very intentional changing that narrative as we move forward, because I think that our students and community deserve that. So it's just persistence and determination.
I think Eric's hitting on a lot of really key points. And he brought it back to the values. And I think Minneapolis was really setting an example of how do you make sure that your values and your vision are reflected in your budget, because that's what creates the sustainability for this work. Because as Eric has mentioned, I've mentioned, and I'm sure will come up again in the series, this is a process, and it takes time and commitment and constant building. And so the more that you can create that buy-in and create spaces where your teachers union is asking for this and asking to be part of those conversations, and then working to embed this language in bargaining contracts or in budgets or in professional development requirements, I think the farther along the school is moving, even though that can feel really, it can feel like it takes a long time to build that.
Yeah, well, and it's rough. I mean, it's really, when you're engaging, as we're engaging with each other, and historically people feel they've been harmed, or the narrative is a negative narrative. We have to engage in the work in a space of empathy, and try to understand the other perspective. And we also have to be self-aware and understand what we're bringing to the conversation. And you have to give people space to share what they feel and how they've been harmed, and not take it personal. So there's the piece also of willingly engaging in the work, naming issues of power, naming the historical narrative and discrimination, and to like honestly engage in the work. I mean, I think that's, again, going back to what's happening in Minneapolis and also across the nation with police officers, and other forms of demonstrations of social inequality. I think that the reason the dialogue isn't as honest is because we've never really been honest about the dialogue. People have never apologized and recognized that power is being used in a very racially oppressive way. And you haven't seen a lot of white individuals in areas of power, positions of power, say that. And so then, this idea that you can't treat everyone as human beings until you recognize and state that we have not been treating people as human beings, and we have not been recognizing the full humanity of certain groups of people until you have that honest conversation. And then you have to hear how people have been harmed, and you have to feel that hurt and pain in order for people to fully engage. So that's challenging because I think, you know, I mean, I think with, you know, working with unions or working with, you know, like we're having to listen, and we're not there yet, but we're going to actively do it because I think that, again, our children deserve it, and there's no excuse for the students to historically be, you know, miseducated, undereducated. We have one of the largest achievement gaps in the nation in Minnesota. And there's just no excuse for that. There's no excuse, and that's really on the adults not doing our work the way we need to. We have to, again, from a transformative SEL standpoint, recognize our agency, recognize our power, and really start managing what we're feeling as we're engaging with each other so that we can support our kids, and then recognize like what we need to know so that we can do our work better.
Yeah, I really second that. I apologize, Lydia. And it's the adults in all of the systems. So
Yes.
It isn't just about the building, the district. It is at the state level. It's the legislature, it's the school
Yes.
board, it's the Department of Education, it's the governor's office. Like, where are they prioritizing and where are they putting their values when they develop the budget? So I think recognizing that this is a larger conversation.
Yes.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate the way that both of you referenced the amount of time that this work takes. It isn't a moment in time initiative that we put in place that we're excited about. It will get hard. Both of you spoke to the fact that the work is challenging. I mean, it requires this internal introspective piece, you know, that some initiatives may not require. I mean, a literacy program might not require you to go internally and to dig up, you know, what is it that I need to shift to be able to teach this. So it's that technical and adaptive mix that makes it very difficult from time to time. I know that we are just about out of time, and you two have masterfully answered so much of what folks have been asking about. I do want to elevate one question. Your quick, this is not a quick synopsis, so I'm asking you to do the miraculous thing here, but it is a question that's coming up in our political context right now. And then we'll take you over to giving us some of your key takeaways. But a question came in where folks are wondering, the idea of anti-racism might be seen as more of a political issue, and some might see it that way. And so how do they manage this conversation in a country that is so polarized? We know how polarized we are right now as a nation. How do you take it from that level of politicizing this conversation down to the humanity piece? So if you can just give us a snippet and then we'll jump to key takeaways, we would really appreciate that.
So you start with that one, Bill?
That's not a snippet.
Inherently in that question is so deeply saddening to me as someone who works at the state level, that it is pushed into the environment of a political conversation about whether we value, well, actually the fact that we do value some of our kids over other kids. That to me shouldn't be a question of politics. It really is looking at our values, and our values need to be in education deeply rooted in doing the work as white individuals, and primarily a white state, not primarily white state anymore, but primarily our educators, our mental health staff, our administrators are white people in Minnesota. And so we need to really dig in and make it not political work, but make it a priority of our work, that we are looking at this, not just transformative SEL, but I would say even if we're choosing a literacy curriculum, we need to be reflective of, is that curriculum really setting all of our students up to be successful? Is that reflective of the culture that we're serving? Is that going to be culturally affirming to our students? Is it going to affirm all the different parts of their identity? And so it saddens me that it is a political issue, and I'm really I know that we on my team and my division are really working to push that into, that's just the first step.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, as you're saying that extending that if we're not honoring the identities, you know, we are emotionally hurting our students. You know, and I should, like, I've experienced that. We've all had that experience coming in through your education and not see yourself reflected in what you're reading, or giving the perspective of being a young African-American boy, you know, and having that teacher not affirm the perspective. I mean, so this structure of racism and what the systems value or not, it really goes down to the classroom, what we teach, how we teach, the power, but it's ultimately we're harming our students. We're harming our communities. Families are not fully participating in our structures. Community members don't feel heard. They don't feel, and again, they don't feel fully human because a set of policies and practices that we've historically done, you know, over hundreds of years. And so you have to acknowledge that people are hurting because they're not heard, they're not seen, they're not valued. And so fundamentally, this is what it is. You know, the conversations we're wanting to have in Minneapolis is that we can be our best selves when we feel fully human, and we make choices on recognizing humanity, for example, on how we teach, what we teach, what we reward, how we define what a good principal is, how we define what a good teacher is, what we put on agendas. And so I think that's how you take that structure and those policies and practices that ultimately impacts how people are engaging with each other. And so you have to do it on those multiple levels: policies, practices, buildings, what do your plans look like, and then how do the individual students, adults interact with each other. So that's how we try to do it. We have a policy 1304 in Minneapolis, which is an equity policy. You know, I'm very proud that our school board says that as adults in the system, we're compelled to address institutional racism. That's in policy. Now, the extent that the system previously had brought that policy forward and said, look, that's something we're proud of, and then put support around implementation of that. So that's what we're doing now, as we're taking our values and we're driving those values towards action so we can impact our students and our families in the district. But it's the policies, it's the embedding equity and SEL in the school improvement plans, and the committees. So we want to see proportional representation on our committees of like site councils and budget committees in schools. And then it's like, what are we valuing about how we're teaching and what we're teaching? And again, putting the resources behind that, because we make choices about, you know, literacy, what we teach. You know, who are we providing? I went through an entire, even in graduate school, I was taking an economic policy analysis unit, and I didn't have any economists of color. And I asked the professor, you know, like, where are all you have to tell me there has to be an economist of color somewhere in the United States over the past 100 years. And so that's what we do sometimes to make folks feel invisible. And that was me as, you know, an adult. And I felt at that point in time, I didn't feel engaged. So think about what we're doing to our students on a regular basis, and not even, you know, it's not about like providing opportunities, but also actively engaging in the perspectives of those authors, actively engaging in the perspectives of the students. Like it's all values, and but it's also we dehumanize people when we omit. And so those spaces where people, I just really believe this, when people feel valued and and respected and honored, they're going to show up amazingly. And those spaces where they're not, they're going to disengage and go somewhere else. And that's why this work is critical. The transformative work is critical, not only educationally, but just at least in Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis, and I think it's statewide. We just have to do a better job in this work.
Appreciate that for sure. How would you wrap this up? I know that our time is over. Unfortunately, we have so much to talk about, but never enough time. If you could leave folks with just a few bullets on what they could do as they're thinking about really cultivating this vision around SEL and equity and SEL in service of equity, what are some different ways? Just 2 to 3 bullets from each of you, snapshots that they could continue to think about as they push into this work. Heather, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think we continue to go back to it, that your values need to be reflected in your vision. They need to be reflected in the work that you're doing, in how you're choosing transformative social emotional learning as a priority. So really making sure that you're starting with the values. I think the fact that it's an iterative process, this is you're going to start and you're going to stop and you're going to keep working, and there isn't a we started here and we're done in 2 years sort of a thing for transformative SEL. And really the last part of our conversation and this series in general has really pushed me to think that the behavior and attendance and even social emotional skill development is deeply driven by the adult behavior. And so we need to first start with the adults, all of our adults inside the school building, supporting the school building, and be sure that they are really doing the work of transformative SEL and self-awareness and social awareness especially.
Yeah, I would say, so this work of transformative social and emotional learning is for everyone. In a school district, all departments have a role to play in this work. And so it has to be across multiple departments, and there has to be ownership beyond just an equity department or a social and emotional learning department. And so again, I'm fortunate that we have that in the same unit. I think planning, being very intentional in your planning as you're doing this work, not only identifying your values, but identifying, making sure you have a representative group as part of your planning process, your visioning process, and that your facilitation method takes into account issues of power and understanding, and being very intentional that, again, if you're going to have students on groups, that you're equalizing power and you're creating a situation where they have the information they need to fully participate. And so I think the planning, being inclusive, and then I think also what I see is I recognize the issue of time and being, I think oftentimes we have this, and I call it this culture in which we're trying to do this inclusive work, but we have to do it in a month. And again, we're not honoring voice. You can't honor voice if you're not willing to make time, create time for people to fully engage and understand and learn. And that's the biggest challenge, I think. But you have to do it, and everyone feels much more positive. And we have not perfected that in Minneapolis. We're trying to do this transformative work, and we're saying, and by the way, you have to get it done in 2 months. But we're trying to be more deliberate about that. We're having those conversations about the tension of being inclusive and sharing power and providing enough time for that to occur. I do believe with the work around climate, I do believe the work around our equity, professional development, and our academic department curriculum transformation, we are making the time to say this is going to take us 3 to 5 years, and we're going to come back to the community and to our school board every month, every year, and detail progress and show progress. But you have to provide the time for people to fully participate. Otherwise, it doesn't feel authentic.
Thank you. Heather and Eric, I just want to thank the both of you for the time that you've taken to really engage in this conversation. You've left us with invaluable tips, nuggets, whatever you want to call it. There's just a lot of information here that we can process, digest, work through as we begin to think about how to make this work practical from our standpoint individually, and how to bring this to the system level as well. To our participants and viewers, I want to say thank you for joining us during this first session within our 5-part series. You heard a lot of reference about beginning with the adult and making the adult work matter. Next session, we are diving deeply into how do you prioritize adult learning. We definitely want you to continue to join us. If you haven't registered, please be sure to register, not just for the adult piece, but for all of it. Join us and stay with us as we continue this really pertinent conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.